Listening is an overlooked part of the communication process. And I invite you to check out this growing archive on the subject of listening. While it may not be something that is an algorithmic darling, it is something that may be of help to someone out there. I'm going to start off this installment by noting that I began thinking about material for this installment as I went to my cardiologist yesterday, and I'll come back to that. But then I started thinking about again the relationship show that I've described previously in another installment. And what I noticed was that when folk get into an argument about who's not listening to who, one of the reactions is anger and in some cases rage. So what ends up happening is that you see this relationship, you're watching these relationship shows, and it's as if people are ticking time bombs as they interact. Of course, it makes for good television. It's entertaining, but I'm looking at it from the angle of how things get to this point. And if I can show how things get to that point, it may help you down the road. So here's how it goes. First person says one thing. The second person disagrees and attempts to set the record straight. Invariably, the first person attempts to get their point across again in an effort at holding their position, proving whether they're right and that the other person is wrong. So, how do they do that? They may repeat their initial statement, thinking that, well, maybe they didn't hear what I was saying. So, the second person, in an effort at maintaining decorum, attempts to de escalate matters by making a calm appeal at showing why the first person made an inaccurate statement. So the first person now feels as if the second person isn't listening. So to achieve some clarity, they may repeat what they've said slowly and with some kind of accentuation and enunciation of certain words. Now, if that doesn't work, or what you may see invariably on some of these shows is that, or maybe it's how it's edited, the second person realizes the same thing but in reverse. The first person isn't listening to them. So now things tend to go sideways rather quickly given the unresolved differences and underlying issues. So the question then becomes, who is listening to who? Does either party care? Now, you might ask, what may be the nature of the conversation? In the context of the relationship show, the first person brings out that the second person has a history of doing things that the first person doesn't like. Let's just say, for example, that second person is not responsible with the mutual checking account. So that second person is spending money that isn't there. Now, that's material for a real good disagreement that may go sideways. So one person is likely to entrench himself or herself by shielding and shutting themselves off from the other person, turning their body away from the other person or looking up and down, away, and it may be talking over the other person to try to get their point across. So when that occurs, then someone is likely to go ballistic. Emotions may reach pitches of yelling, screaming, cursing, and crying. What is the result? A relationship that's in trouble, and it may take more to understand where things went wrong. Now, I mentioned about going to the cardiologist. I went to the cardiologist because a few months back, and this is the history of things because I can share the history of things because this is the first time I'm mentioning it on this series. I went in late December for a routine procedure. And just prior to the procedure actually taking place, in which the doctor comes to my bedside and introduces himself, one of his assistants notices on the monitor that my heart rhythm isn't in sync. The top ventricle is not in sync with the bottom ventricle. That assistant points out that I was in atrial fluttering. It's similar to atrial fibrillation, but atrial fluttering is something that's a little more, let's say, predictable. Um, and so uh, they told me, well, if we can get this straightened out, or if this thing straightens itself out, then we can go ahead on with the procedure. If not, you may need to go to the emergency room to find out what's going on. Now, it also didn't help that my blood pressure uh was actually high. It was almost through the roof. And uh I'll just say this, that I had one other experience with my blood pressure being out the roof just a few weeks earlier, which was contrary to what my blood pressure reading was just a month earlier when I went for a physical. So it seems to me that some things are going wrong and I don't understand, and I'm not liking what's going on, because if I have to go to the emergency room, I'm thinking as a customer, now they're going for the medical billing trifectas here. And so what ends up happening, I go to the emergency room. I go to the emergency room. Blood pressure isn't coming down, unlike what I thought, because I had a history of what I call this white coat fever, in that I can go, no matter, if I go anywhere around medical personnel and they take my blood pressure the first time, it just be high, and then give me about 15-20 minutes, it comes down to normal. It didn't do that. Meanwhile, the atrial fluttering, the top ventricle is not in sync with the bottom ventricle, the heart's electrical system. And so when the cardiologist comes to me, he says, well, we're going to have to admit you to the hospital for observation. It did not occur to me that I was admitted into the hospital, but I was admitted to the intensive care unit. I was there for observation, and observation only. Coming out of the hospital, they got my heart rhythm back in check through medication, and then they prescribed me certain medications. Okay. Now, what I'm getting at is I had no knowledge of my body being in atrial fluttering. And basically I had no knowledge that my blood pressure had gone sky high and was out of check. Case in point, 2 days before I'd gone for what should have been a routine procedure, I did some work in which I went up and down 3 flights of stairs. I made 30 trips up and down 3 flights of stairs. And you would think that if there was something really wrong with me, I should have fell out then. But that wasn't the case. So what I'm getting at is, after that hospital experience, it dawned upon me that things could have really gone many different ways. The most likely was stroke. The other possibility could have been heart attack. The other possibility could have been heart embolism. Another possibility could have been death. And so you realize, man, you were in pretty bad shape. You just didn't really know it. The only thing that was consistent out of all that time in the hospital was my heart, my pulse rate. My pulse rate was very good. Go figure. So what I'm getting at as an example of not listening is when we don't listen to our bodies. It did not occur to me until after the fact that my body had been telling me signs that something was wrong. I'd been going around for weeks and maybe months feeling as if my head was about to explode on me. I'd been going around for weeks and maybe months feeling horrible, in that when I'd wake up, I wanted to go back to sleep. My body was telling me things. I just did not listen. I chose not to listen, or I didn't know. So a couple of things that hinder our listening, or it could be our ignorance and obstinance, being stubborn. Now, I say that because along the way, it appears sometimes that the medical profession is guilty of not listening to a patient. I'm pointing that out, and you'll understand why. They know, and the assumption is that they know, we don't know. So we tell them something that's wrong with us. They seem not to listen to us. We may go to one doctor, another doctor, and they're telling us one thing, we're telling them another thing, because we are in tune with our bodies, but it's a little bit of arrogance on their part. This is a common situation with Black women. Many women have died at various stages during pregnancies because the Black woman tells them something's wrong. They disregard the common situation that somehow a Black woman presumably has a higher tolerance for pain, or higher tolerance for medical maladies. And it's well documented how many Black women have died during stages of pregnancy because they tell them something is wrong. They need epidural, or they feel something's really going wrong with the body, but nobody listens. And then all of a sudden, you hear, doo, there's this indifference. So, what is the result if we are ignorant to what's going on, or if we're stubborn to what's going on, or if we're different to what's going on? Very serious medical consequences. So, as a review, as I end this installment, what are some of the signs that hinder listening? I mentioned ignorance, obstinance, and indifference. Others are arrogance, a defensive behavior, inconsideration, and selfishness. Well, if you like what I've shared in this installment, hey, hit that subscribe button, give my content a thumbs up, and share my content among others. And look for the next install on this social media.